My name's John Quilter. I'm a philosopher at the Australian Catholic University in Sydney. I live in the Hunter Valley, so at the moment I'm working from home, so I'm ensconced in my library. It's lovely to be here. The only thing better might have been to see you all in Rome. I've been working in philosophy for nigh on 40 years. I have had a number of roles in that connection. Most of my interests are in fairly standard sorts of areas in philosophy. Philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, philosophy of religion. I have done a lot of work in moral philosophy and bioethics, though that's now behind me by about 15, 20 years. And in recent times, I've been interested in some specific issues about the interface of mainstream religious traditions in relation to each other and the changing world they find themselves in. And to that end, I think the stuff we find in Don Cupitt is some quite interesting material in relation to this. He's more or less taken a fairly extreme response from within a Christian tradition. And it's that to which I'd now like to address myself. The paper is a survey, really. It's my effort to get a fix on how Cupitt's thought has developed over several decades. I think there are, broadly speaking, 3 periods. And those periods have corresponded to developments in his own engagement with contemporary postmodern philosophy and changes in the place of, well, for him, the Anglican Church in England, but broadly speaking, Christianity in the Western tradition, and then globally during the latter half of that 20th century. So if you've had a chance to read it, what I've done today is I've got together a few points in a presentation, which can I share the presentation? Oh yes, there we go. I'll pop that up now. Can people give me an indication that they can see that? Yeah, great, thank you. I'm always anxious about whether people can actually see what I can see in these things. Anyway, so what we've got here is just a few comments of a critical nature from my side of, from my take on what Cupitt argues, recommends, his own articulation in a philosophical / theological way of his own, of his religious sensibility as it's developed out of his life of academic work and work as a clergyman in the Anglican Church in England. So I have here 5 points. We can focus on whichever of these people find most interesting. So I might get reactions from the group to see if there are things that strike them as more interesting than others. The first is, in the paper I've emphasised that there's an important shift takes place towards the end of the 90s in Cupitt's development. Whereas under the fullest sway of the influence on him of postmodernist continental philosophy during the 90s, he would have rejected a distinction between great questions of life and questions of mundane significance, or questions of less than ultimate significance. He would have rejected such a distinction as without any foundation. There's no distinction to be made good between deeper and shallower issues. deeper and shallower responses to questions, etc. By the time he gets to the end of the 1990s, he's done some work on what he calls, you might think of it as ordinary language theology, by analogy with ordinary language philosophy in the 40s and 50s in English-speaking countries. This is a series of books in which he looks at phrases, stock phrases that we use in ordinary English, like, the meaning of it all, what life is, what life can do to you, these sort of more or less throwaway terms that most of us reach for when life gets the better of us, or we're faced with a crisis or something along these lines, but we sort of try to struggle on. So he takes these terms and he explores them for what significance you might find in them. And he finds that this language expresses a kind of sensibility sensitive to, distinctions about depth and shallowness, big stuff and little stuff in life. And out of that, he develops this battery of great questions of life that he thinks are really very important, but places them, of course, in this postmodernist framework. So within this anti-metaphysical, anti-foundationalist postmodernist framework, he distinguishes a number of kinds of question that are expressive of this sensitivity to issues that are big, issues that go to meaning of life, issues that go to the sort of things that in the perennial philosophy and in, philosophy 100 or theology 100 or even religious studies 100 kinds of subjects would be treated as ultimate questions and the like. So on page 12 of the paper, I've got an illustrative list of these questions. So one of the issues that I have about this that I think is worth putting a little pressure on Cupitt about is that if there are these great questions, if there are these distinctions of depth and shallowness, of ultimacy and mundane issues in life, it would also seem that we have here an exercise of critical concepts of appraisal that distinguish between, say, good and evil, between intelligent and daft, between intelligent and unreasonable, between various other kinds of areas where we deploy language that is evaluative, language that is designed to, or that registers these distinctions that go to our sense of ultimacy versus matters of a smaller, less significant nature. And these concepts deserve to be given an exploration against exactly the background that he had taken previously to imply that undermine such distinctions. That's an important point, I think, because it means that a lot of the worries that he has, the ways he has of diffusing various kinds of dualism between inner and outer, higher and lower, transcendent and immanent, etc., in favour of a flatter notion of existence in which these distinctions don't get a grip, now becomes a framework wherein you can actually exercise and explore demetaphysicalized, de-foundationalistic understandings of these sorts of contrast. And if that's the case, a lot of the argument for the either-or approach to many of the issues he addresses, so that you've got to choose between either transcendent God or a wholly immanent atheism. You've got to choose between a sense of reality in an inner life versus a public giving away of the self into a wholly objective sphere, etc., in favour of the immanent, the objective, the naturalist, and so forth. A lot of those distinctions, those dualisms, then don't have to be capitulated into, decided in favour of one side or the other. There are ways of walking a line here between these contrasts that enable you to capture valuable bits of each. So if this critical questions issue, these great questions of life issue, that is to say, gives us a hook to criticising a lot of the dualistic thinking that you find in Cupitt. And that sort of, you can then extend this into some other points, I think. The way he treats globalization and some of the opportunities for religious development in a modern, secularized, naturalized, globalized world enables us, if we've got these critical concepts that are not marked by traditional metaphysical and foundationalistic kinds of framework, we can reapproach the way he deals with the impact of globalization on religion. I think problems start to emerge about his notion of solar living in a theatrical self. And I know my time is limited here, so I'd sort of like to get an indication from people if they'd like to pursue anything in any greater depth in the time that we have. Another aspect of this that's connected to the globalization point is how he deals with detraditionalization, and he sees his approach to the new religion of the everyday as an alternative to interfaith dialogue and various of the new religious movements and their descendants. And I had a couple of comments about institutions and individuals against the background of his overriding worry about individual freedom and autonomy and the dangers of institutions in a postmodern world like ours. Okay, so I'm happy to take this wherever people would like to. So I would like to throw the floor open and invite people to ask any questions they have. And we can take this. That's what I've got. That's what I've brought to this. There are a few points that occur to me. There are others as a philosopher that I'd be interested in pursuing that are more technical. But I think these are some that might be I thought these might be some points that would be of interest to folks. But I may be wrong. So I'm very happy to talk about whatever people would like to talk about from this stage. But please understand, I'm assuming that you've had a chance to read the paper. So, would anybody like to jump in at this point? Please feel free. I suppose you've had a long day.
Thank you so much, Dr. Quilter. We have about 5 to 10 minutes if our participants would like to put questions in the chat or just unmute and ask Dr. Quilter personally anything that you would like to say or comment on, please do so. Unfortunately, we don't have an official moderator for this session. We had some miscommunication happen, but I'm here, so if you wanted to message me your questions, you can send them my way and I will ask for you.
Would it be better if I got out of the presentation now?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, good. Are people familiar with Cupitt at all? And I must admit, I'm uncertain about the pronunciation of his name. Cupitt, Cupitt. So he understands himself as a part of the radical theology movement that began in the 60s in the US, and part of his dialogue with other Church of England Anglican theologians is against that sort of background. And I think after about the 1990s, the Anglicans have ceased engaging with him. He was the Dean of Emmanuel College at Cambridge for a long time. But he continues to write, and he's one of these extraordinarily productive men. And a constantly moving target. Part of the fun of this is seeing how the developments make sense organically in his own thinking. I think there's a shift at the end of the 90s that has meant two things. Membership in the Anglican Church is a funny thing. Depending on the national church you're in, there are different degrees of doctrinal constraint that limit people's freedom of movement intellectually. The Australian Church is one of the most intellectually constrained because of the nature of its constitution. But the Episcopalian tradition in America is one of the least constrained, and you've got the Englishman in the middle. But Cupitt has always been, as it were, at the extreme left end of this scene theologically. Began as a kind of Kantian regulative theist, as it were, anti-realist right from the beginning, as best as I can tell anyway. And but that has gone through these stages of evolution. When we get to the middle 90s, he's just, he's ingested Nietzsche whole. He's adopted this very expressivist, anti-realist, anti-metaphysical understanding of anything to do with religion. But he remains a member of the Anglican Church. And in the early 90s, he gave up celebrating sacraments as a priest, but remained a priest. And didn't actually withdraw from the church until 2008, by which time it already effectively stopped practicing, but and was involved in the Sea of Faith movement, which has quite a bit of support in parts of Australia and New Zealand. And I'm not so sure about the US, what that Sea of Faith movement's like over there, but I know it has some quite outspoken supporters here and in New Zealand. But I think I find one of the, there's a couple of chat questions here. Can I speak about the issues of detraditionalisation and do-it-yourself religion? Okay. Yeah. So Cupitt takes detraditionalisation as a fait accompli, right? It's a fact already, and maintains that represents a kind of constraint on what religion can be into the future. In contrast to the detraditionalisation that's got its grounds in globalisation, Traditional religions, he argues, are essentially local and essentially grounded geographically / culturally, so that their future in a globalized world is very, very tenuous. And so he's very unconfident about the prospects of interfaith dialogue. He thinks that at best it can be a kind of hail fellow, well met, agree to differ kind of reaffirmation of each other's differences without any prospects for moving ahead together into the future. At its worst, a kind of reassertion of local prejudices and a source of division and controversy and conflict. So he thinks interfaith dialogues are hiding to nowhere. He also is very critical about new religious movements because he thinks that they, because they're so self-conscious about where they've come from, are going to make all the same mistakes of the tradition, with distinctions to do with transcendent world versus immanent world, the public face of a believer, and their inner reality and relationship to the divine and all of that sort of thing. Just reformulating the tired old dichotomies that are getting us nowhere. So he sees his new religion of the everyday as a way forward for religion in the future that enables individuals, decoupled altogether from institutions and traditions, to construct their religious sensibility in concepts that they take by sampling religious motifs, religious ideas, via their access to them through the internet, and integrating them as they like, according to their own best lights, in their own lives as individuals. And that's the way forward, by and large. But he sees that as needing intellectual discipline and so forth. Now, I guess the problem I have with this is the sorts of reasons that one has, that he argues there are for being cautious, even skeptical about new religious movements, will apply to this kind of process as well. If he's talking about intellectual discipline and thoughtfulness in the construction of an autonomously one religious sensibility achieved by sampling religious ideas via access to them in the internet, if there's some sort of intellectual discipline here, that's something that can't be really given any content or substance without reading it off some background of intellectual inquiry. These things don't just come out of nothing ab initio. They grow organically out of practices of intellectual investigation, various kinds of blind pathways that go nowhere, others that go somewhere, fertile cross inseminations of different lines of thought and different methods of inquiry and so forth. And that's just how these things happen. You're in a tradition then, once you're talking about this, or you're looking at the intersection of traditions and so forth. The problem that I have with the DIY thing, that DIY aspect of what Cupitt seems to have in mind, is that it's the why bit, do it yourself. We've sort of got past Descartes, and I'd hoped that some of the lessons of the post-20th century, post-World War II 20th century philosophy were that we started to understand the social dimension and the traditional and historical dimension of all this stuff. Whereas Cupitt seems, on the one hand, on the one side of his mouth, to to affirm all that, on the other hand, on the other side of his mouth, he seems to think the individual has this capacity for a kind of omniscient capacity with intellectually critically disciplined critique to be able to absorb, jam various traditions together in ways that can be resourced by internet access to these things. And I think this is pie in the sky, to be honest. So, it's very hard to see how any of that sort of vision could take place with any substance without something along the lines of interfaith dialogue. And it depends on your notion of interfaith dialogue. A lot of interfaith dialogue can be point scoring, can be one-upmanship and so forth. It can be the reassertion of local privilege and prejudice. But I think there's an opportunity for interfaith dialogue that's of a very different kind, particularly if you take it out of the hands of religious leaders and put it into the hands of, dare I say, philosophers in a religious tradition and religious scholars in a religious tradition who don't have the obligations that religious leaders have to serve and protect the interests of their tradition as institutions. Those opportunities are something that I still think deserve exploration, and they're not. My perception is, at least, that the will for interfaith discussion has taken a bit of a knock in the recent years, and I just think that if some of the stuff that Cupitt, Cupitt's got his own metaphysics despite decrying metaphysics, but if we just set that to one side and look at what can be gleaned in a constructive mode from his criticisms of where we're at and some of his ideas for where to go, there are promising opportunities here that are to be a shame to waste. But I don't think we're going to get there if we just stick with the DIY approach of Cupitt exactly.
I'm going to pause us right here and move on to our next presenter, and then we can come back to Doris Van Gaal's question in our Q&A session.
Okay.
So our next speaker is Nanako Sakai. I'm really sorry if I'm not doing these names correctly.
No, you are correct. Nanako, yes.
But she will be presenting on mysticism and animals in Shintoism.
Okay, thank you very much. So, as a Japanese, my English is very bad and I have a strong Japanese accent. So I try to put text in my PowerPoint, and I'm a visual person. So I made many PowerPoints. So I want to show you many visual images as possible as I can today. So maybe you will feel very quick as I showed you my slides. So thank you very much for wonderful opportunity today. So I'll go to the share screen now. Do you see my screen now? Does anyone unmute and let me know?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay,
Thank you
very much. Okay. So I'll go to slideshow. Okay. So my topic is animals and mysticism in Shintonism. So my question begins, for example, is it so strange to say that we should pay more attention to animal behaviors, or feel as if animals want to tell us something? Because in Japan, there are observations that animal know natural disaster in advance, and they escape before actually earthquake hit in that area. So I thought there's something mythical which human beings do not have, or maybe had it before, but now we forgot that we lost that kind of what is called the sixth sense. So the term Shinto means the way of the god. So Shinto is the indigenous religion of Japan. So it's back to prehistoric times. So this is called Tori. I'll explain about it. So Shinto is the oldest organized tradition in Japan. And also there are many gods, which I explained today. Shinto is very unique because it's more centered on the land and people of Japan. So it does not have universality in the way that Christianity or Islam or Buddhism do. So mountains and trees often become the object of worship, and Shinto shrine has archways called tori, and there's a sacred Shinto ropes called shimenawa, which mark the sacred areas. So this is a rope called shimenawa, and shire, which is this cutted white paper. And it means when you see this one, that means the tree has something sacred. It's different from the tree in the highway or in the street. So it's easy to recognize the sacred tree in Shintoism. So this is tree, and it's an archway making the entrance to a Shinto shrine or other sacred site, formed by two upright pillars and a cross beam. So the origin of tori were perches, P-E-R-C-H-E-S, perches for roosters offered to shrine. So it's a recognized symbol in Shinto. So this is a famous tree in Itsukushima Shrine in Hiroshima Prefecture. You can actually walk to this tree when the tide is low. So it signifies passing from the ordinary life to the world of the sacred. So this is, there's a kannushi, which means Shinto priest. So it is heredity. So when one was born in Shinto's family, son or daughter will inherit this Shinto priest work. And they do making offerings or reciting Shinto prayer. So there's women kannushi. So the left side photo is women kannushi, and the right side is called miko, altar girls. So this is Shinto priest. These are official or ceremonial clothes, and this is usually they wear this one, and this is also miko's, the altar girls' clothes. So regarding the sacred text, two texts in Shinto. So one is Kojiki, Chronicle of Ancient Times, and the second one is Nihon Shoki. And these are most important early texts, which was written 7th and 8th centuries. So there's a keyword, kami. Kami means gods in Shintoism. And one of the famous one is Amaterasu, sun goddess. So kami means spirits or gods or deities. And kami live in the force of nature. So there are two types of kami. One is mythological kami, and the other one is kami associated with nature. So the land, rivers, mountains, oceans, all the large tree or all the rock, and also human beings are born from kami. So these kind of old, this is old cherry trees. So there is something people thought there is kami in this old tree. And this is Shinto home altar called Kamidana. So people worship of kami at either at home or at shrine. So this is a small one, and this one is a little bit large one, and this is mirror. And these candles and water, and sometimes these green plants called Sakai put in this water base. And there's also keyword called misogi. Misogi means purification ritual by using water. And in Shinto, spiritual impurities are thought to be very bad thing, so it needs to remove by practicing misogi. So it must be done during very cold winter, because if it is summer, it's just for fun. So it must be conducted very cold winter. And this is Miko's practice of misogi. So Shinto shrine and roosters has very interesting relationships. And because roosters or hens are thought to be the servants of the Shinto gods. So there's a story. Today I want to tell many stories. So Amaterasu hid HID herself into the cave called Amano Iwato. The world became dark. So from contemporary view, probably it was a solar eclipse or something, because suddenly the world became dark. So rooster played a major role by crowing in front of the cave when Amaterasu hid herself in the cave. So when Amaterasu was successfully pulled out from the cave, yes, this is the illustration. So she hid herself and other goddess dancing, and here is the rooster. So they crow. So roosters receives an honored name, Tokoyo no Naganakidori. So that means crowing birds of the nether world, and becomes the servants of Kami. So here's the roosters here. So here's the Ise Shrine. This is one of the famous Shinto shrine. So every 20 years, the inner shrine of Ise Jingu, which dedicated to sun goddess Amaterasu, destroyed and rebuilt with new woods. So the process takes a long time. And the last one was 2013, and the next one will 2033. So when Mitamashiro, that's the divine presence, is transferred from the old shrine to the new one, a Shinto priest, make a sounds of a rooster 3 times. Kakeko, kakeko, kakeko. So even today, Ise Jingu and other Shinto shrines keep free-ranged roosters and hens in their site because respecting Tokoyo no Naganakidori had a role to call Amaterasu, and Amaterasu came from the cave. So this is based on the story. So another story is the white hair of Inaba, so from Kojiki. So a story begins with Onamchi. This is one of the god called Onamchi. And later he became the land of Japan and acquired the name Okuni no Shi no Mikoto, or Okuni no Shi no Kami. So Onamchi accompanies many older brothers, gods, to visit Prince Yakami. She was a very beautiful prince. So his brother wanted to marry her. So, but Onamchi was, he was youngest. So Onamchi was forced to carry all of his elder brother's bags. So he was behind for his brothers. So during the trip, the brothers saw a hare, H-A-R-E, the rabbit, whose skin was torn off by crocodiles. So the hare explains that it tricks a group of crocodiles into crossing the river by pretending to count their numbers. So I can count yours. So please, I want to go to the other side of the river. So when the hare almost reaches the opposite bank, the rabbit, the hare said, "Oh, it was cheating," and that made the crocodile angry. So that the skin was torn off. So there's two stories. One type is shark, and the other one is crocodile. But I prefer a crocodile version because shark's skin is so, I think it's slippery. So probably crocodile was right, but there are a lot of story about that. So the elder brothers did not feel pity for the hare and suggested the false treatment that caused more pain for her because you should put your body in the salt water. So as a result, he became more painful. The rabbit feel more pain. So Onamichi later came across the hare and felt sorry after listening to his brother's deed for the poor hare. So Onamichi told the hare the proper treatment by washing the body in fresh water and puts the powder of lead, LED, to the body and lying down. So the hare was recovered, and the hare predicted that Onamichi would be the one who marries Princess Yakumi. And he married Princess Yakumi and survived various trials and finally became the master of the land and called Okuni no Shino Mikoto. So another one is mice and daikokuten mice. So mice are thought to be pests, but Japanese people believed that mice have possessed some mystical power because they go between this world. They can go between this world and another world, underworld, where human being cannot go. So here's another Onamichi's story. His calamity continued. And one day, during his escape trip from his brothers, because his brothers had very envious to Onamichi, but then he almost killed by another god, Susanoo. So here's the story. So Susanoo shot an arrow to the field and ordered Onamichi to bring the arrow to him. And while Onamichi was searching for it, Susanoo set fire. So he was soon surrounded by fire. And then a mouse came to him and said, "Uchi wa hora hora, soto wa supu supu." And the inside is empty, the upper side is narrower. So he could find the place to hide, and he survived. So this is the illustration. Susanoo is here, and there's a fire, and mice appears, and says there's a place to escape. So after this episode, Mouse thought to be very good relationship with Onamichi, and became the servants of God, Shinshi. And people thought sudden disappearance of mice is a message from probably something unusual would happen soon. So prepare for or escape to the safe place. And it was important to prevent, to escape from earthquake or fire. So it's thought to be important message from the mice. So another one is samurai wear armor and arm at the battlefield. And these are called kawari kabuto. So this is actually helmet. This is shrimp, a large shrimp. And this is also dragon fish, I think. So samurai wanted to share the mystical power of animals, birds or insects or seashells. So they wear kawari kabuto. So these are also kawari kabuto, and these are centipede kabuto. So another one is Kitsune and Inari. There are Buddhist lineage and Shinto lineage of Kitsune Inari shrine. So these are most famous one is Inari shrine in Fushimi Inari in Kyoto. And there's a many, it is called the thousand tree. And the color is brilliant orange, vermilion orange in English. So these are gods of the left side, Ukanomitama is Shinto lineage, and Dakini, it is Buddhist lineage. So sometimes men or women, the gender is very vague. Sometimes man become women or depicted as men. And its roots is thought to be Dakini was related to maybe Kali in Hinduism. So it has a dark side of Kali, and when it is combined with Buddhism, the face or figure is a little bit different, but they still possess same shadowy aspect. And this is a Tibetan version of Dakini. So you will see the difference between Tibetan version and the Japanese version of Dakini. So the
You have 1 more minute.
Okay, earthquake and animals. So there are many earthquake tales in Japan. So during Edo era, people believed that earthquake is caused by catfish. So there are many pictures about regarding catfish, because catfish are thought to be cause earthquake. But there are research about this kind of by using catfish, and there's a relationship between electromagnetic field and catfish. So my conclusion is there is something mystical in about animals. So we should pay attention to animal, because when the river is too dark, we cannot live. So we should pay attention to what animal tells us. So that is my conclusion. Thank you very much. So I should stop my slide here. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing. Our next presenter is Julianne Hazen.
Yes.
Thank you. And she will be presenting on peace through love and self-knowledge in Sufism.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. I'm really glad to be part of this conference, and I thank you to everyone who has taken the time to participate this afternoon. I'm a senior lecturer of religious studies at Niagara University. And yes, my talk is called Peace Through Love and Self-Knowledge, Sufi Concepts of Peace. Abdul Karim Ben Gura's 2005 edited work, called Islamic Peace Paradigms, lays out 5 approaches to peace based on the work of Abdulaziz Said. The 5 approaches include peace through power, peace through law, through willpower, communication, and also through love. So I'll be focusing on the last one, peace through the power of love, transformation of the person and community. But to be honest, I've really struggled to put together this talk, because having lived through the pandemic, witnessing the racial and economic inequalities, and now watching the violence between Israel and Palestine, peace in the real sense of the word seems unattainable. It seems out of touch with our reality right now. But as Sheikh Asif of the Alami Tariqa would say, as long as there is breath, there is hope. So I hope that tomorrow will be easier, hope for less violence, more fairness, justice, hope for human connection, and for love. Love is an important concept in many religious traditions, including Islam. My studies, both academically and personally, have been on Sufism, which might be described as the mystical essence of Islam or the heart of Islam. Those in Sufism believe that a lot of personal and interpersonal conflict comes from failing to recognize and uphold our interconnectedness. Those on the Sufi path strive to actualize this togetherness, oneness, unity of God, known as Tawheed. They do this by seeking a personal transformation, of destroying the lower ego, it's called nafs, and doing what is beautiful, which is known as ihsan, so that then the divine attributes can shine through, like a reflection on a mirror reveals the image of the beholder. In this case, it would be a reflection of the divine. Now, this requires an inner transformation through which the individual becomes more in tune with what is real, Hak, creator, sustainer of all. This paradigm believes in the goodness of people, the innate goodness, and upholds the teachings of the Quran and Hadith, the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, and what they express, that God created humanity specifically for the purpose of manifesting love. It's been argued by Ibn al-Arabi, known as the greatest sheikh, among countless others, that love is the key to Islamic faith and practice. 8th century Sufi saint Rabia al-Adawiyya demonstrated the role of love in her famous verses. She was seen running through the streets of Basra, carrying a lit torch in one hand and a bucket of water in the other. When asked, the torch was for burning paradise, and the water was for dousing the flames of hell. Why? Because she found people to be distracted by trying to gain one and avoid the other. She said, "O Lord, if I worship you out of fear of hell, burn me in hell. If I worship you out of the desire for paradise, lock me out of paradise. But if I worship you for yourself alone, do not deny me your eternal beauty." Rabia was demonstrating that even though paradise and hell, can become like false idols and interfere with the pureness of worship. Throughout her life, she exemplified how God should be worshipped, not for this or that reason, but just sincerely. As humans, we often interact with our surroundings from a place of longing or fear. Often our lower selves, or nafs, as the Sufis would say, dictate our reactions. And thus, you can say that they are directing our journey through life. In our current society, there is a tendency to focus on me, on the self. How many influencers, well, I don't know if you all have been following influencers or not, but how many influencers or articles on celebrities or online posts did you see just this last week that have encouraged us, the readers, to do what we want, what feels good, what brings the most immediate benefit to us? I find that insults and witty responses are glamorized. Today's society emphasizes self-gratification. I come first. And this is a form of self-deification. And it's argued that this will lead to ethical chaos. The Quran says, "And this worldly life is not but amusement and diversion, but the home of the hereafter is best for those who fear God." And it follows up with a question, "Will you not then reason?" So these verses are encouraging us to use intellect to help understand how fleeting this existence is and where we should focus our energy instead. There's a concept in Sufism called dying before you die, Fanna billah. In short, it means to die to the ego and come into complete acceptance and harmony with the divine before you actually physically die. Interestingly, the word Sufis often use for love is ashq. It can be spelled various ways, like I-S-H-Q or E-S-H-Q. It's a Persian word, and it comes from the word of a vine that wraps itself around a tree and actually kills that tree. But don't grab the pesticides yet. This vine is the love that overpowers that ego, that self, and therefore only love remains at the end of this process. But it's tough to conquer the ego because it fights to stay in control. Al-Ghazali, Sufi philosopher and theologian of the 12th century, wrote how humans can act in a way that is higher in goodness and righteousness than even the angels. But on the flip side, we can act lower than demons. This depends in large part on our ability to overcome the lower self and achieve this higher existence. Prophet Muhammad advised to interact with the world at a distance. According to the hadith, the things he said, be in this world as though you were a stranger or a traveler. When evening comes, do not expect to live until the morning. The Quran teaches that all of this material existence will end, as it has already ended for mighty empires and leaders who have come before. It's only at that point, at death, that the real life begins. But how are we training ourselves for this journey into the real life? Are we aligning with what is good and just? Or are we engaging in activities that take us away from goodness and justice? This leads me to the study of divine ethics. A lot of Islamic religious education today tends to focus exclusively on beliefs and practices, while neglecting the importance of an ethical life. The Sunnah, or traditions of Prophet Muhammad, were an embodiment of ethics, driven by God consciousness and love, ashq. The Sufi path, known as tariqa, is a way in which a seeker, someone seeking more, aims to come into harmony with the divine nature and develop this God consciousness and ethics. According to Sufi teacher Javed Mirbakhsh, this involves spiritual poverty, meaning realizing that someone yourself is not perfect, but desiring to be better and to be more perfect, to improve, along with the performance of devotional practices and zikr, which is the constant remembrance of the divine. By the 10th century, the science of living with God consciousness was established in the writings of As-Sulami, Kushairi, Al-Ghazali, to name a few. Importantly, it was more than just an abstract philosophy. It was a way of life supported by the doctrine of Islamic orthodoxy, and it united the outer and the inner aspects of Islam. It interwove and demonstrated the interdependence of orthodoxy and mysticism. This code of conduct came to be studied in mosques, where previously only Quran and Hadith had been studied. This ethical code was a way to lead people to align themselves with the divine and to, eliminate this false sense of disconnect between them and the divine, but also between them and other people. For example, the Quran uses the word fatah, which means a handsome, brave young man. This is the ideal of a person who is noble and dignified, whose hospitality and generosity flows until he has nothing left. This person, Fatah, would give everything, including his life for his friends, and he would be just as generous towards his enemies. There are lots of examples of generosity in the Quran, including Abraham, who unquestionably prepared to sacrifice his son upon the command of God. Another one is Joseph, who's known for pardoning his brothers who tried to kill him and then ended up putting him in the well, abandoning him there. Joseph was also known for preferring to be in jail rather than being tempted into a relationship with the beautiful married woman, Zuleika. That's a tale for stories. Other examples abound, right? But the Muslims point to Prophet Muhammad's life as the most exemplary of all. And his perfection is the goal of those on the Sufi path. He's the best example, they say, of Fatah. His companions were not only witnesses to his excellent behavior, or adab, but also they participated in this excellent way of living. The hadith, the written stories of what happened, tell us that Abu Bakr and Omar, who later became the first two caliphs, competed in good deeds. One day, Omar decided that he was going to try to outdo Abu Bakr in generosity. So he brought this container of wealth, representing half of everything he owned. The other half he had left at home to support his family. But Abu Bakr brought wealth representing everything he owned, and he distributed it to the community. As for his family, he said, they are in the care of God and his messenger. After this, Abu Bakr wasn't seen around very much, and when someone inquired, they found that he actually had nothing to wear because he was sharing his last outfit with his wife. So they could only go out every other day, or when one of them didn't need to be covered properly to go out. So Prophet Muhammad asked his daughter Fatima, and she gave a cloth to Abu Bakr, but it wasn't quite long enough. So Abu Bakr ended up sewing these palm leaves to the bottom to make it proper so that he could go out. And he was expected to meet Prophet Muhammad. But before he arrived, Prophet Muhammad had an interaction with the Archangel Gabriel. The angel appeared to him wearing this odd outfit with this short cloth and palm leaves. And so he asked him about it. And what the angel said was that all of the angels in heaven were wearing this outfit in honor of Abu Bakr, and that his Lord was pleased with him. In another story, in the early years of Islam, Ibn Abbas was caring for the wounded after a battle between Muslims and non-Muslims. He had a water skin and he was taking it to the wounded. But each one he approached told him to give it to someone else who they could hear calling out for water. The second wounded Muslim he approached heard an enemy soldier asking for water and told Ibn Abbas, give the water to that man. So Ibn Abbas went to that man first, and the non-Muslim quenched his thirst. And then Ibn Abbas reapproached the first two, but he found that they had already passed away. Sufis like to tell stories as a method for teaching. I'll share one more that comes from the stories of the companions of Prophet Muhammad. Ali ibn Talib, who became the fourth caliph, was on the battlefield and had overpowered an enemy. He had his knife to the man's throat when the man all of a sudden spat at him. Immediately, Ali got up, put his weapon away, and told the man, taking your life is unlawful for me. Go away. The man was shocked and asked him about it. Ali said, when you spat in my face, It aroused the anger of my ego. Had I killed you then, it would not have been for the sake of God, but for the sake of my ego. I would have been a murderer. You're free to go. The man, it is said, was moved by this integrity and became Muslim. I am only at the very beginning of exploring Sufi chivalry and the Sufi code of conduct, but I find the scope of generosity, compassion, and love to be something that we all might aspire towards, especially in this world that needs good examples and hope for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. This was very interesting to get to hear and learn a little bit about all these different traditions. It's been very enlightening to me. I would like to open the floor up to everybody to ask any questions you have. We can address the one that's in the chat right now that was, I think, directed to Dr. Quilter about being interested in considering the dualism between concepts such as transcendent and immanent, to do so in the context of world Christianity. Integrating, for instance, an African religious universe would question that dualism. If you wanted to comment on that.
Okay. So I don't know anything significant about the African traditions here, so I might have to plead indulgence to de-emphasize addressing that side of the question. But if I could, I suppose, so Cupitt's reactions are to traditional contrasts between a transcendent God and an immanent natural world, and he examines critically a number of these kinds of contrast. I suppose, given the sort of tastes I have in philosophical theory, I'd be inclined to divide and conquer here, as it were. Instead of trying to see them all against a single background, these contrasts, I think, have their own grammar in relation to the settings in which they arise. So the contrast between the transcendence of God and immanence of God to the world in theistic understandings of the God-world relationship have their own grammar in relation to the distinctions and what they serve in that context. That's a different that's a different ball game from a contrast between, say, the inner moral and spiritual reality of a person and the way they're understood in the public world, for example. That's a different set of, that contrast can't be mapped directly onto the other contrast between transcendence and immanence in relation to God's relation to the world. So they're different sorts of things, and I think where one of the mischievous kind of features of Cupitt's attention to these various dualisms is that he's inattentive to those sorts of contrasts between those contrasts, which I think doesn't serve the argument very well. The other thing here is that a lot of the contrasts that he's critical of do have a metaphysical lineage in Western theology and philosophy, and even in sort of popular religious conceptions. However, they get their grip on their way of the grip of their application in life's circumstances say where we protest that someone hasn't understood things justly from the point of view of myself. So you know, we can complain about the way people don't see things justly from my point of view, or another can complain that against you. So they're drawing on a contrast between inner reality and outer appearance. So it seems to me that a lot of these distinctions Cupitt's critical of have a grip on us independently of metaphysicalized ways of marking the distinctions. So even against the background of a anti-metaphysical, anti-foundationalist, postmodernist worldview, we can articulate these distinctions independently of foundationalist or metaphysical understandings of them by paying careful attention to our ordinary ways of speech. And I think I was attracted to this personally for philosophical reasons initially. So, you know, I resist philosophical moral theory for reasons like this, quite independently of any religious or theological considerations. But I think a lot of the lessons you can learn there can be extended into these other areas, such as religious parlayings, articulations of these distinctions. So I'm not in favour of dualisms, in fact. What you get out of a careful attention to the way that these sorts of distinction work in life, I think, is that you don't get distinctions between, say, faith and reason. You get distinctions between different modalities of rationality and different modalities of faithfulness. And they overlap at various points. So that a sharp contrast between faith and reason is unrealistic and insufficiently attentive to our ordinary understandings of these things. And I think the same is true of, in sort of a post-metaphysical understanding of God in relation to transcendence and immanence. As it were, you might say, God can be immanently transcendent and transcendently immanent. We shouldn't just think that there are simple distinctions here. And depending on the, you know, like I think that sort of Celtic notion of a thin place is one of the ways of giving that content. So, but, you know, this is a story that takes us farther afield than we can really pursue here. And but reflecting on Cupitt's anxieties over issues like this, I think are a fruitful ground for getting a bit further on this. So I'm not a fan of dualisms, and I'm skeptical about metaphysics, especially in as ways of trying to articulate alleged foundations for religion or alleged foundations for morality. That raises a whole lot of other questions about the dialogue between, say, atheism and belief. But I tend to just, as a thumbnail account of where I'd go on that, I'd sort of see that a bit as along the lines of interfaith dialogue. And there's a lot to learn from atheisms for religion, as there are for religion, for atheisms from religion. I just don't believe that that's a game that's mutually exclusive. So I'm not big on dualisms myself, but the way to give substance to that idea, I think, is to do this post-metaphysical philosophy. And I actually think it's a general project. It's not just limited to issues of religion. There's matters here about philosophical approaches to morality, philosophical approaches to, say, art, philosophical approaches to various other cultural forms and so forth. Science even. Okay, so I don't know that that answers the question per se, but I hope it gives a sense of how I would address the concerns that I think are behind the question.
There's a question that I think Julianne and Sakai could address about the stories and how they serve as inspiration. I don't know if you can see that in the chat, but if you wanted to just comment on that. Whoever wants to start it first.
If you'd like to go first, go right ahead. It's muted.
Yeah. So would you please tell me the question again? I'm looking at.
Can you comment on how these stories are supposed to serve as some type of inspiration to remember how our foundational teachings must be retained and practiced, regardless of how ritualistically observant one might be? And it appears that the animals of Shintoism exhibit this as well.
So how should I, at the classroom or teaching, this kind of notion should be applied? Is that the meaning of the question, I think? Yeah, so I think the important thing is to accept different notions. I think the story seems to be weird, and maybe students will feel very strange when at first they listen to this kind of story. But story tells something to us, even though the story itself is not so not academic at all and just a story. But I think the meaning of telling a story about the meaning should be emphasis on the story, not the story itself, but telling the story, and students know different religion has different idea, even though it is very weird sometimes. So my students also, at first, they do not know about anything about Shintonism or Buddhism, but they accept the concept. Especially, I'm also a Buddhist, Zen Buddhist, Soto Zen Buddhist. So students accept that even they do not know, they are not sure about rebirth, but at least they understand the rebirth, and it is a set of the concept of karma. So good deeds or good things will cause good effect, and if we do bad things, the result will be bad. And especially in Buddhism, we believe that if we did something wrong, we have to go to, we'll become hungry ghost or have to go to the hell. So I think the important thing is, yeah, ethics, ultimately ethics, but it's based on the story. Story-centered is very important. Thank you.
Yeah, I thank you for that question or that comment. I thought it was kind of neat how both of our talks incorporated the stories, and the teachings. So the stories and myths, they tell us who we are, where we're going, what we're doing. Throughout religious studies, these myths, these stories, these examples have a lot of important qualities. And we're not the first ones struggling to find meaning in this world and trying to get through it. And so using the examples and the teachings as guides and how reflecting on them, how can we learn from the different characters? Who do we want to be like? They provide guideposts for us to get through. And yeah, how to balance the practice, the formal practice of a religion, or with also putting it inside. Because someone can pray and appear to be very devout, but what about their sincerity? What about their actual intentions, the insides of them? So in Islam, there's a tradition, there's a hadith talking about 3 aspects of religion. So Imam, Islam, and Ihsan. And the Archangel Gabriel was asking Prophet Muhammad to teach him about these 3 aspects. And it comes out to say that all 3 are important. So practicing what Islam is, knowing the beliefs, but also ihsan, which is the inner aspect. And you need all 3 to complete it. If one or the other is out of whack, then the person is struggling in that way. So thank you. And I think that's important for, for all of us, whatever our traditions or non-traditions may be. It's interesting. Thanks.
Are there any other questions? Yes.
Since that was my question, I just want to reinforce, and I think that Doctors Sakai and Yurakovic, when I look at this and I look at these stories and I think of the stories from my own Jewish tradition and other traditions that I've learned, I think what they do is they try to get us to minimize hubris and to look at ourselves as part of something much greater. And by looking at these stories that Dr. Sakai told, whether or not they seem reasonable or within our context, what I think they're asking us to do also is to extend ourselves. One of the things we teach in Jewish mysticism is that no cricket, no seed, no piece of creation that was created was without purpose. So all of these animals, all of these creatures that were created have value. And I agree with what you were conveying, that if we're not concerned about the animals, if we're not concerned about the environment, if we don't look at ourselves as part of this bigger system, none of us will survive. I really believe that. And then Dr. Durakovic, what you bring to the table with your stories, I believe, is the notion of, yes, you look at it as generosity. And my friends who are secularists and do not see themselves as part of the faith community would say it's understanding what is best for us in the best possible way. They would say that you don't have to be religious to appreciate all of these things. And I wonder sometimes, in terms of what Dr. Quilter was talking about in the beginning, if all of these structures, and I deal with this all the time as an academic, as a teacher, as a in every which way as a personal practitioner, that how do you keep the ritual, how do you keep the rhythm of that religious life from getting in the way of seeing and acknowledging your part in the bigger picture? So that's where I think the stories are just so incredibly powerful. And that may be part of the answer to Dr. Quilter's issue of the DIYers. If I can look at those stories and see myself as something bigger, there is no such thing as DIYers. It's doing it in a community or in a collective or whatever. That's what we're looking at.
Doris, would you like to ask your question and come off mute?
Yes, it's actually, I think it's more a comment than a question, and it's for Dr. Hazen. I hear just so many resonances with the mystical theology of John of the Cross, and I've related it to African migrant experiences, and just love as the principle both of purification and illumination, and it's all about the balance of desires and humility and generosity, growing in the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. So it would be really cool to kind of connect it, and that way you get the interfaith contribution and maybe together we can stand strong in love or something. But yeah, thank you for your stories there. Yeah, stories are important. That's what I learned in working with the migrants too, like the narratives, the storytelling, the sharing of the meaning of the stories and how they bring to life those deeper sense of our lives is very beautiful. So it's not a question, just a comment. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, going physically, having that challenge, you know, John of the Cross, and carrying it, and how that changes you internally as well. You know, opens you up in different ways, and it's all a process. At one stage, you can only see so much, but as you proceed, things will, you know, you're opened up more and more, or you're taken back and you realize you have to do more work on this other level, you know, layer that came up. It's like an onion, as some people would say. You know, it's just layer after layer of learning. And yeah, the human experience too, you know, just so atheists, you know, everybody can relate to trying to be a better person, trying to be more just. But religious traditions have these stories that play an important role in it. Thank you.
Quilter has this question he put in the chat about how do we make our religious stories live for people now? And I don't know who it was directed towards, but whoever wants to answer that or comment on that question, feel free.
May I comment on it? That's my question. So it's that I think everyone's right about this. Story is very important, and it's a kind of direct, as direct a way of communicating important matters of the spirit and the heart as there is. But often I think those stories, communicative force, their power, is supported by the cultural environment that they grow up in and are heard in. And we're entering into this world where what our cultures are going to look like is in the lap of the gods. We just haven't got a clue. And those developments are going to take their own organic directions, but essentially locally. You know, I mean, so globally, I suppose capitalism is the economic system, but capitalism in Sweden and capitalism in Japan are very different animals. And so all of these global realities are going to be enculturated as you'd expect. So there's this constant dialogue between the more global and the local all the time. And the same's going to affect religious storytelling to address religious sensibility. And these, I guess one of the impacts of, and it's a problem for the West more than it is for the global East, because we've metaphysicalized religion so much historically. And there's this conflict between, there's this sort of common ground philosophically between what the, you know, stories about the origins of the universe in religion and the origins of the universe in science, and all these different approaches on this sort of philosophical common ground arena. That's had a decaying effect on the efficacy of story in the West as a religious modality of understanding. And I'm, where do you go from there? I just don't know how you move forward with that. On the one hand, you can't tell new stories because it's part of the tradition that they're grounded in these ancient stories. And that's as true of Islam as it is of Judaism, as it is of Christianity, as it is of any of these traditions. And I just can't help but think that the arts have a special role here. I'm not sure philosophy in the West is in any condition to be very helpful, to be honest, because it's taken the directions it's taken. There is a kind of philosophy that I think may be helpful, but I don't think it's certainly not a majority way of doing philosophy in the West at the moment. And I just, so to that extent, I'm uncertain about the value of philosophy in that for the West anyway. And there may be sources of illumination from Eastern thought here that may be more helpful. But I just think we're in a kind of crisis in the West, and we really underestimate it, because still our institutions are limping along quite successfully in material terms, but we've lost the heart of the constituency. And I think that's a real challenge.
So to that point, really quickly, I do, and I plan and program a lot of multi-faith programming. And what we've done is the stories do not have to be universal. It's exactly the way it was here, where each of you shared stories that were specific to your context, to your culture, to your religious background, to your ancient, to what we call in Hebrew, Yerusha, to your heritage. And what I find that does is it helps us to see each other outside of the politics, outside of the modern fences that everybody's building. And it takes us all back to our roots. And in that way, we find out, yeah, there are foundational elements such as generosity that we all share. And there are things specific to our context, such as this understanding of the centrality of animals.
I actually just would like to add that what's the way to go with stories? Like what Dr. Sandra says, like she's just doing it, right? She's just organizing storytelling moments. And storytelling is one of the code words in one of the parishes I work for. It's a large immigrant community. We have like 148 different nationalities hanging around. So storytelling is very central too. And what you learn from the people who are not the migrants is they're parched too for stories. And I think the problem is I think indeed that the stories have become irrelevant, maybe because we did all the beautiful metaphysics with them. But I think the time is there to just start telling them and to have people connect with them from where they are at this point in their existence. And then they will start to come alive again, but we should not be afraid to do it. So I think, and we don't, so one of the things is we don't give a SHIAT if we tell the stories in such a way that the Archbishop is not happy with them. So you just do it because we got to, and people are actually parched. So I think it's a thing.
I think, I agree with you. And I think what's happened is that there were periods of time where people felt they needed to release themselves from the bounds of their background. I'm from a European background. My mother's first language was Yiddish. When I talked to my chronological peers about what I had to negotiate with my parents and what they had to negotiate with their parents, we're talking completely different generations, even though chronologically they're my peers. My family was much more European based that way. So you came through, I've worked a lot in education. So I use the example, when I came home from school and I had a textbook in my hands that my mother recognized, they'd say, oh, that's great. That's a really good textbook. I used it. Now, if your second grader comes home with the same textbook your fifth grader used, you're calling the school to find out why they're not using the most up-to-date book. And I think that really tells us something about people really depositing their historical backgrounds And now realizing, well, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Look at Native Americans, look at the indigenous people of the United States trying to recapture their stories. I know that's happening in Australia as well, because I'm hearing it from Jewish day school folks. I do a lot of consulting and a lot of work with folks all over the world in terms of educational institutions. It's happening in so many places where people are turning around and go, oh my goodness, I have this identity. And now with Black Lives Matter and people telling their stories, and I just watched, there was just a thing on CNN about this community that was destroyed in 1918. And there was another program on the Black church and why it became such a powerful piece in people's lives, and Asian Americans. Now, as all of us are being the objects of this hatred that we're all seeing, people are going back and saying, well, wait a minute, what's my identity? If American isn't enough, or if whatever country that I'm in isn't enough, what is my identity? So I do think that there's a moment here that is very scary, very upsetting, but also a really important opportunity for us to reinforce the importance of these stories.
And I think, I'm sorry, Julianne, you wanted to say, go ahead.
Thanks. I just, yeah, if I can talk personally about what's going on, the sheikh in our community, our Sufi community, the spiritual leader, passed away in December. And so we're grappling with how do you preserve his stories and about him for the next generations. So yeah, it's talking about stories, and some of the stories that I read, actually he taught us those. So those are back in, those are preserved. But what about his personal stories that he would teach and how he would interact with people? And so, do you have everyone share stories, get together and submit something? Or it's just a challenge that we're going through right now as well. So thought I'd share that. If you have ideas, you can feel free to send them to me. Maybe we should all share our emails. What do you think of that?
Great. So Julie, just so you know, what I'm doing is I do a lot of intergenerational programming. And what I've been doing, this is also a way to address people that are in their 70s, 80s, 90s, 100, because they're amazing educators. They know these stories. And when you get people to tell the 100-year-old woman who's telling a story about her grandmother, I mean, you've got your history there, We're like Chief whoever sitting in the middle of his circle with the bonfire telling the stories that his chief told him. And I mean, from the Jewish point of view, that's what the Talmud is. It's all these stories that people would pass down from generation to generation. So it's just telling people to tell their stories, just share their narratives, what's meaningful to you. Sometimes bring an object, that's helpful. Like if people have a specific set of candlesticks or, whatever it is they have, there may be something in your family that you could, there's all these prompters. So if anybody wants to engage in ongoing discussion about storytelling and the value, I'll put contact me. I think that's right. Yep, that's right. And we can definitely continue that thought.
Can I jump in? Yeah, I was just thinking about something, Sandra, that we had mentioned in our previous session. That's in addition to all the challenges that we face, I think that John was mentioning about storytelling and its place in the jumble of global issues. I think one of the positive things that I'm seeing is a new context, and it's the intercultural context. So we're not just telling our stories about ourselves to ourselves, although that's a very important part of it, because there's recovery happening of things that are lost or potentially threatened with loss. So we respect that, and we continue that storytelling tradition to keep things alive. But this new context is a very exciting one because the audience is also changing. The audience is often intercultural. It's people who want to hear our stories, who want to know about us. And it's a new opportunity to hear ourselves talking about ourselves and so on, but also to hear the other and to learn from the other. There's this religious dimension to it. And I don't mean interreligious in the sense of, converting anyone or, but just in responding to this hunger that we heard about, this desire for stories, I think it's completely indiscriminate. It's a welcoming. It's tell me a story. I want to hear about you. I want to know about. So I think it's a beautiful thing. And it's a beautiful opportunity that we also have, in addition to all the challenges and all the uncertainties that we face in our world. Thank you.
Well, can I ask Doris a question? You're on mute. You're on mute, Sandra.
I'm so sorry. I thought I was. In terms of what you just said, Andre, just to keep in mind also our 20s and 30s something, this generation now is lost. They're lost. They need the stories. So that's a whole other piece of this for those of you that are in university environments or high school.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. So Doris, may I ask you a question?
Sure.
So you insist that the stories need to be told regardless of what the bishop or archbishop says. And evidently there's a background story in itself. And one of the differences between Christianity on the one hand and Judaism and Islam on the other is that in most versions of it, Christianity's got this pretty rigid and pretty powerful power structure, hierarchy. That gives the tradition strengths and it gives it weaknesses as well.
Right.
I'd like to hear some thoughts about that. How do you negotiate some of that, and what are some of the perils and opportunities dealing with that for you that you've encountered?
So the reason is that I say that we don't care, and we are going to continue to tell the stories the way our community feels they need to be told, is that our pastor was a leader in the city of Baltimore. There's a lot of shit going on in Baltimore, and so everything to do with Black Lives Matter has also everything to do with LGBTQ and all kinds of bigotry, whatever you talk about. And he speaks truth to power, and so he's being retired. So everybody's really very upset. But we're kind of like, these stories need to be told, things need to be changed. The structure has gotten too rigid, and they've forgotten the core of the message. They've forgotten that it is a message of love, of compassion, of welcome, of forgiveness. And I think the Archdiocese of Baltimore, but a pretty chunk of the Catholic Church in the United States of America. I'm Dutch, by the way, so I'm one of those radical Catholics from post-Vatican Council kind of Schillebeek students. So there you got it. So it's just kind of like we have to break this open, because if we don't break it open, the stuff that is really important to us from within these stories is going to get lost, because it'll come less and less relevant for the younger people and people around us. If we make ourselves irrelevant to the city, if we make ourselves irrelevant to the very large Black community in Baltimore, if we make ourselves less relevant to the LGBTQ community here, then the whole faith we could just better throw it away, because then it doesn't have any meaning anymore. And I think that's where the storytelling comes in, where we use the stories of our faith, of both the Hebrew scriptures and the Gospels, and we tell them in our way, integrating them with our existence and the experiences we have now. And that's where the prophetic stuff comes out. And leaders don't typically like that. But I think we have to. And I think although we were punished, the determination has only gotten bigger, sort of. And that's the power of storytelling. It's transformative.
Something may say from over here that the American Episcopate and the Catholic Church seems to be not bringing glory upon itself. It's got a tendency to sort of a reactionary nastiness
Right.
that is surprising, actually.
Yeah.
From I'm still sitting.
Maybe you should write a letter and let them know. They might not have a clue themselves.
Oh yeah, I'm sure they'll listen to Hunter Valley Anglican priests. not. Yeah.
I wondered if
But it's one of those opportunities where, like, the sadness or the destruction part of it actually brings about that opportunity where we can create transformation. It might not happen tomorrow, but if we hang in there, something might break.
Well, I think too, trying to bring those ancient stories into connection with contemporary ones. So we have stories like the stories of Dorothy Day and the stories of Martin Luther King and so forth. And they're not, one of the things that I think is important about those more modern ones is, well, and like the ancient ones, right? King David was no, he was a complex person, right? Complex figure. As I think Muhammad is, right, in the Quran, in fact. Contemporary, modern people don't like bullshit. And I think that's really important. They have a distaste for cant and bullshit. And it's very important to be accountable for those aspects of church, synagogue, mosque, temple history, as well as upholding the more idealistic and hopeful stuff. I think one of the things we had a Royal Commission of Inquiry into institutional responses to child sexual abuse here in Australia, a government-led thing, and I think it's cast a shadow over the future of religious institutions, not just the church, but religious institutions in this country for a generation, to be honest. And if religious institutions here are going to be trusted again, we've got hard work to do. But, we shouldn't be live in cloud cuckoo land and imagine that all that goodwill that used to be there, even among secularists towards religion, is going to be there, because there are too many bad stories that people can tell each other about and have told each other, thankfully, in these sorts of contexts.
I think also the problem with that, and I know a little bit about Australia because working with the Jewish community, there was a big scandal in one of the boys' schools and one of the girls' schools, and it was international, and oh my gosh. And I think the problem is what I see, a lot of people are going into the silo. A lot of people in religious communities are saying, this is my community and I'm not looking to the right, I'm not looking to the left. Kids shouldn't either. There's also a lot of denial. Be religious, be this observant. You won't have all these problems. And hello, really? Really?
No, That's
And
what
that's-
caused the problems. Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Exactly,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
So the point
Exactly.
is to know, A, that this is not a new problem, B, it's a systemic problem based on how they choose to live, and C, if we can get a grip and get a context and get a perspective on who we are and what we're supposed to be using all of these means, then we can begin to address some of these problems.
Yeah, and I think too, for all the great, the big world traditions, dislocated adherents are a kind of beacon for hope, in the sense that, so I take it, Julianne, you're a Muslim, but clearly you've got I take it from your name, some sort of Eastern European background.
My husband was, from Croatia.
Croatia. Well, you should be Catholic if in terms of those traditional categorizations, right? So,
Oh, well, he was born in Bosnia, so.
okay. Oh, okay. So that's a complicated part of the world. All right, fair enough. But I suspect, the chief rabbi in New York, there's a very, his name is escaping me, a leader of one of the biggest mosques in New York. These sort of Western Islam, Western Judaism, African Christianity, these may be sources of refreshment that although the Nigerian evangelicals can be worrying, these sources are things to be grateful for, I think. And some of the capital that's been lost in the West by the mainstream traditions can be refreshed, I think, from some of these other sources.
Yeah, I've also witnessed that. Yeah. I think there's actually a hadith about it. Religion will go from the east to the west, like Islam would, and then from the west to the east again. So yeah, that revival of people looking back at the sources or finding their own, and then inspiring, or people who have become Muslim. Like I became Muslim out of high school. And so, that I found when I tell my story to other people, that enlivens their own feelings towards their faith, towards Islam specifically. So yeah, interesting. And the acculturation of the religion in the current setting is also a reinvigoration of it.
Yep.
Yeah. I think we're going to be shut down soon.
Yep.
So do I.
But I've enjoyed it, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Me too.
Thank you for your presentation, John. Yeah.
Well, likewise, both of you, and for the questions and discussion. It's been great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all. This was really great. This was a really good discussion.
Yeah.
Be well
Good
all.
luck.
Hope to see you tomorrow.